Hey, so I know that we talked about this course being a great course for people who know about their settings and want to take their skills to the next level. So that being said, if you know f-stop, your ISO, your shutter speed, those kind of things, you can just skip on to the next lessons where we actually dive in and go start taking photos. But I did want to give a quick refresher for those of you who are jumping into this class and haven't picked up your camera for a while and need a little refresher on those main settings, because we're going to be talking about these throughout all of our demonstration videos, starting with your aperture, which is your f-stop, and that refers to the opening inside of your lens. So every lens has an adjustable aperture. If you make it bigger, more light comes in, meaning that your photo is going to be exposed brighter. Your image is going to look brighter. If you close down that circle, it's going to let less light in, making it darker. So we might refer to some things as closing down or opening up our aperture. That's what we're talking about. The f-stop number refers to that opening, the size of the opening. And this is where it can get a little confusing for people because, at least for me, when I first heard about this, it was confusing because the lower f-stop number refers to the bigger opening. So an f2, for example, is a bigger opening, lets in more light than, say, an f11, which is smaller and lets in less light. Different lenses have the ability to go to different f-stops. Some lenses start at an f4, and even some lenses, if you zoom in, it won't even open up to that f4. It'll automatically adjust to, say, an f5.6. Other lenses, and typically more expensive lenses, can open up to a wider aperture like an f2, f2.8. This lets in a lot of light. The other thing that you have to keep in mind with your f-stop, also known as aperture, is that it affects the depth of field and how much is in focus in your plane of vision. With a higher f-stop, remember, a higher f-stop means a smaller hole, letting in less light, more is in focus in your plane of view. So for a lot of landscape photography, if you're trying to get the distance in focus, you're trying to get some stuff in the foreground in focus as well, you're going to want to go to a higher f-stop number, a smaller hole. If you want more of that depth of field, more of that blurry background look, then you're going to want to open up to a wider aperture, one of those lower f-stops, f4, f2.8, something like that. Next you have shutter speed, which is how much time you expose your sensor. In old cameras, it was literally how much time your shutter would open and close. Your shutter speed ranges from a long exposure, which we're going to be doing in another class on night photography, where you can go have a 20-second, 30-second, 2-minute, or beyond shutter that literally allows light in for 2 minutes or longer, whatever you set it at, to expose your photo. A shutter speed like that is ridiculous during the day because it's going to let in too much light. It's going to be overexposed. So you're going to be using shutter speeds that are in the fractions of a second, 1/60th, 1/100th of a second. Going out here and just doing some test shots, I was even using 1,000th of a second shutter speeds because there's so much light. One key thing to remember with your shutter speed is that it's literally letting light hit your sensor to expose your photo. So if it's a long shutter speed and you're moving your camera around a little bit, you can get a little bit of camera shake, a little bit of blur in your image. A lot of students ask me about photos being out of focus or blurry. Well, that can have to do with your focus actually being out of focus, but a lot of time it's just the camera shake and having a longer shutter speed. We typically recommend using shutter speeds faster than 1/80th, 1/100th of a second. That will make sure that you're not getting any camera shake while you're shooting. Of course, you can use things like tripods or monopods to get stabilization, to get those longer shutter speeds. If you're shooting something that is faster, say you're out here shooting landscapes and you're trying to get an animal, a bird that's flying by, you might have to crank up your shutter speed to make sure that you're capturing that motion crisply. Lastly, we have ISO, which is the sensitivity of your camera or the sensor in your camera. This is basically digitally enhancing your image, making it brighter or darker. Your ISO settings range from 100 up. Some cameras can go up to over 200,000 ISO. The lower ISOs, like 100 or 200, is less sensitive, and the higher ISOs, 1600, 2000 above, are more sensitive. So if you change from 100 to 200, your image is going to get brighter. One thing to note though with ISO, like with all these settings, there's things to keep in mind. If you increase your ISO a lot, you start to get some digital noise. You'll see a little color pixelation, looks like color grain in your images, especially if you're shooting when it's dark out, at night, or in low light. A lot of people set their camera on auto and it will automatically crank up the ISO into the thousands, and you get your photo, you look at it on the screen and it looks fine, but then you bring it onto the computer and you start to see some of that digital noise. Usually that's due to your higher ISO. Some cameras are better at handling higher ISOs. The newer mirrorless cameras can go up into the tens or hundreds of thousands ISO and still get a pretty clean shot. But with a basic DSLR or your iPhone or another smartphone, a higher ISO will get a little bit noisy. So now you know what all these settings are, and that's going to be the same for pretty much any camera. You can change ISO, shutter speed, and aperture on a DSLR, on a mirrorless camera. Sometimes in smartphones they might have settings like that. Even point and shoots have these settings. But how do you put it all together? Well, it really depends on what style you're going for. Typically, during the day with a cheaper DSLR camera, we're going to want to crank down our ISO so we're not getting any of that digital noise. Then we're going to set our f-stop depending on how much depth of field we want. So if we want it shallow, we're going to use a wide open aperture, a low f-stop. If we want a lot in focus, then we're going to use a higher f-stop. And then once you set your settings, you can either just take a test shot and see how exposed it is, and if you need to make it darker or brighter, you can adjust. Or you can use the light meter, which is the little line at the bottom of your panel back here, or you can see it in your viewfinder. Ideally, you're trying to get that mark in the middle to get it well exposed. Now, of course, if you want to get more creative, you don't always have to pay attention to that light meter, or you don't have to put it right in the middle. You might want it a little bit darker or brighter if you say you want a silhouette or a slightly overexposed image. With some of the new mirrorless cameras, you have a live exposure preview. Whether you're looking in the viewfinder or the back of your camera, you actually see what your image is going to look like. Unlike with my Canon 70D, when I'm looking through this, I'm just seeing what's through the lens. I'm not seeing if it's bright or dark depending on my settings. So in the next videos, we're going to be out in the field talking about our compositions, but also talking about the settings we use. We're going to be testing out different apertures, different shutter speeds, and you're going to see what it looks like for our cameras. As always though, the best thing to do is just to go out and practice. There's no specific settings that we can tell you to use. You're going to have to get out there and practice.